Time for another board game review, and this time we have the game Pandemic Fall of Rome. This was sent to me by Z-Man Games and is designed by Matt Leacock and Paolo Mori. Citizens, soldiers, and allies of Rome unite in Pandemic Fall of Rome. Raise armies, defend your cities, and forge alliances to ward off the relentless incursions. Can you hold the line against the invading hordes and prevent the fall of Rome? Let me show you how to play. So Pandemic Fall of Rome is a variation on the very popular cooperative game Pandemic. Now, if you haven't played Pandemic, essentially you are cooperating together and the players all win or lose together. Your goal is to ally with and or eliminate each of the 5 invading barbarian tribes. Those are the cubes of different colors. Before the Roman Empire is overwhelmed. You can lose in several different ways if either Roma or too many other cities are sacked, if any tribes have overrun Roman territory, or if the empire's resources have run dry. Each person plays a different character with a different role. I'll go into those later. The game is set up in a way in that some of these cities will start with barbarian cubes in them, and then your starting locations for your characters depend on the cards you have in your hand. Depending on the number of players, with 5 players you get 2 cards each. You get to choose a city to go in if you have that card. Now, each player turn is divided into 3 steps. First, you do 4 actions. Then, you draw 2 player cards and resolve any revolts. I'll go into that in a second. And then 3, you invade cities. After doing that, your turn ends, and the next player goes. Now, since this is a cooperative game, you should always freely give each other advice, letting everyone offer opinions and ideas. Your hand can have both city and event cards in it, as you can see here. I'll explain the difference between those in a second. Most event cards can be played at any time, including during another player's turn. So let's go over the actions you can do. You can do up to 4, like I mentioned, and you can do any combination. You can do the same action several times, or do one of each, or, it doesn't really matter. But one action you can do is move your pawn to an adjacent city, connected by a single uninterrupted line of any color, even across water. So this player could move here. That's one action. That's march. You may also take up to 3 legions from your city with you. However, you cannot move into these barbarian supply spaces. These are not cities. Another action you can do is sailing. As you can see, the green player is at Roma, which has a port icon next to it. If they discard a city card, they can travel to another space that has that port symbol, but it has to match the color you discard. So if he discarded this Roma card, he could go here, here, here. Any orange space with a port symbol. So let's say he goes up here, and he can take the legions with him. Another action you can do is fortify. If you discard a city card that matches the city you're in, you can add a fort from the supply to your city. So the teal player here could discard the Philippopolis card, and then they could put a fort on this space. If all forts are in use, you move a fort to your city from another city on the board, and each city can have up to 1 fort. I'll explain fort's significance later. Another action you can do is recruit army. You can add legions from the supply to your city. The number of legions you place is equal to the recruitment rate. That's up here. So during this phase of the game, you can recruit 3 legions. However, there must be a fort in your city for you to do this action. So let's say the brown player, let's say there was a fort here. Then they could use recruit to put 3 legions on this space. If there are not enough legions in the supply, you can place as many as possible, but you can't move them from elsewhere on the board. Another action you can do is battle. Let's say that the brown player uses one action to move to this space and brings 3 legions with them. Now, if you want to battle these barbarian cubes here, you roll up to 3 battle die, depending on how many legions you have. Since they have 3 legions, they can roll 3 die. So if we roll them, wow, that's a great roll. 3 cubes means you remove all 3 barbarians. However, if you ever roll a side that has a legion on it, like this one, you would have to remove one of your legions. This one, you remove a cube and a legion, 2 cubes and a legion. And also, this symbol means you can resolve your special effect. The brown player's special effect is Regina Fordurata, which, as you can see here, after the battle, remove 1 barbarian from your city if you do add up to 1 legion to your city. So they're all about getting those reinforcements, which is pretty nice. Any legions or cubes that are removed are returned to their supplies. Another action you can do is plotting. Let's pretend that these 2 players were in the same city. If there's another player in your city and you both agree to it, you can do one of the following. Let's say the white player had the Brundisium card. And since they're in Brundisium, they could give this card to the teal player since they're on that space together. Alternatively, if it was the teal player's turn and the white player had this in their hand, then they could take the card from them. The hand limit is 7 cards, so if you ever have more than 7, you have to discard immediately. Another action you can do is forge an alliance. Now, different colored tribes require a different number of cards to ally with them. But essentially in this game, you're trying to arrange it so that you give certain players the same color types of cards. So let's say the green player was on this space. Now there has to be a barbarian of that tribe's color on that space if you want to do this. Now, if the green player had 4 teal or whatever this color is, 4 teal cards in their hand, they could discard these cards and then they could form an alliance with the teal barbarians. And in that case, you would put this here. If you can enlist alliances with them, that's one step closer to victory. Now, just because you forge an alliance with a tribe does not mean they stop invading. They will still, continue to invade. But you need these alliances to help you win the game. Because remember, the victory condition at the end is to either ally with all of them and or kill all of them. So if you have the teal alliance, you don't have to worry about them as much, and you can focus on either allying with the other barbarian tribes or wiping them out. Now, what makes these alliances so useful is, now that we have the teal alliance, let's say there were 3 of these teal cubes here, and the blue player moves onto this space. This action is called Enlisting Barbarians. If you discard a card that matches the color of that tribe and you have an alliance with them, you can remove all the cubes from that city automatically as an action without having to roll dice. Then you can add that many legions from your supply to that city, essentially in replacing them, which is great. So those are all the actions you can do. And once you've done your 4 actions, at the end of each player's turn, you have to draw the top 2 cards from the player deck. Ooh, Revolt card, that's unlucky. Now, these Revolt cards are randomly distributed equally throughout the deck. You take the deck at the beginning and you divide it into equal piles and put one in and shuffle them and put them all together. So you don't know when these Revolt cards will come out. If they had just been 2 regular cards, you just take them into your hand and go on to the next step. But if you draw a Revolt card, you have to do the following steps. First, you have to move the invasion rate marker 1 space to the right, which is going to make the game harder as it goes. Because as you'll notice, the further it goes along, the less legions you can recruit for your actions, and also the invasion total, which I'll get into in a second, is going up, which is bad. Then, after you increase the invasion rate, you revolt. You draw the bottom card of the barbarian deck. In this case, it's Syracuse, and you add 3 cubes to that city. So Syracuse is getting some reinforcements. Then you discard the card. Then, and this is the worst part, you take that discard pile, you shuffle it, and you put that on top of your deck. And you're going to see why this is bad in a second, because then it's the invasion phase. Alright, so you drew your 2 player cards, and there was a revolt. Regardless of whether there's a revolt or not, after you do your 2 player cards, you invade cities. You check the invasion rate, which in this case it's currently 2. And invasion in this game is actually different than how Pandemic works. But let's draw the cards. So the first one we drew is Carnuntum, all right? Oof, that's bad, because Carnuntum is going to get sacked because there's a 4th cube on here. I'll get into sacking in a bit, but let's put this here for now. Now, how invasion works in this game. Let's say I had instead drawn Mediolanum. A city can only be invaded if, first off, there's a cube of a barbarian cube in that city already, and if the previous city on that migration path has 1 or more barbarians. There has to be a chain of barbarians to that spot. So in this case, if I had pulled Mediolanum from the barbarian deck, there's no barbarian here from here. So I wouldn't put a cube here. Instead, I would trace back. Oh, is there a cube here? No. So I go back and I would have to put a cube here instead. But let's pretend there had been one on Euvavum. And I pull the Mediolanum card. So I wouldn't put one here. because there's no cubes here. Instead, I go back. Is there a cube here? Yep. I add a cube here instead. And you have to make sure that the chain is not broken of barbarian cubes. Make sure that the previous city has cubes in it. Now, the legions are useful because they can defend a city if the card is pulled. Let's say I pulled the Tyrus card. Now, there is a difference. If the legions are supported by either a player's pawn or one of the forts, if I pull this card during the invasion phase, I can just remove one legion and block the cube. However, if the brown player was here instead and I pulled the Tyrus card, there's no fort here or player, then all the barbarians get removed. That's called an ambush. And finally, let's go back to sacking. Now, if you've played Pandemic, you're very familiar with this mechanic. If a space ever has 4 of a color of barbarian, the city is sacked. What happens is you move this decline marker down on this track. If you get all the way down here, you lose. If a fort was here, you'd return it to the supply. Then you have to add a barbarian from that tribe to each adjacent city, which sucks. So 1 cube would go here, and 1 cube would go here. Even though it's not even on the same migration path, this cube is going to go here, and it's going to spread. Now, if 3 cubes had been here and I sacked, you have to sack again, which sucks. It's just going to chain. And you move the marker down accordingly if it chain reaction sacks. However, if a city was already sacked, then you don't add a cube to it again. It doesn't just keep going back and forth. Now, if the city of Roma is sacked, you immediately lose. Or, if you ever reach the bottom of this decline track, you lose. So you don't want cities to get sacked. Now, once you've pulled your invasion cities cards, which suck, your turn ends, and then the player on your next to your left can do 4 actions, and then you draw 2 player cards, resolve revolts if you can, and keep invading. That's it. Very simple sort of phase of do 4 actions, draw 2 cards, invade cities. Now, I mentioned before that there are event cards in this game, and there's an actually pretty interesting mechanic with corruption, which I'm going to go into in a second. So here we have Make Haste Slowly. These cards can be played at any time, and they're not actions. So this one, you can say, choose a city, move 1 pawn to it with permission. This lets you move your pawns very easily. But if you choose the corruption version, you can actually move any number of pawns there, which is powerful. But if you ever choose a corruption version of an event, you have to move this decline marker down. And so you have to decide, is it worth it to decline your civilization and get closer to death to do specific powers? Another example, the die is cast. During one battle this turn, set the die to the results you want instead of rolling them. Or, if you do the corruption version, do the above for every battle this turn. And here's one more example. Your death, my survival. You replace 1 barbarian with 1 legion, or, if you do the corruption version, replace up to 3 barbarians in 1 city with an equal number of legions, which is very powerful. Now, the game ends if you manage to, like I mentioned before, forge alliances with the tribes, and or there are no barbarians of that tribe in any cities on the board. So, let's say I made 3 alliances with teal, orange, and blue. And then I killed every black and white cube on the board. At that point, you immediately win. So it's not like original Pandemic where you have to make alliances with all of them or cure them all in Pandemic's case. And there are 4 ways to lose the game. I mentioned if the decline marker reaches the 8th point or if Roma is sacked. But 2 other ways are if you run out of cards in the player card deck, you lose. Or if you need to add barbarian cubes, but you can't add the correct number, you also lose. Basically, if you run out of any color, which is why you can't just let them roam free, even if you've allied with them. So that's pretty much it gameplay-wise, but let's go into some of the roles. First off, we have Magister Militum. When you do the battle action, you can reduce the number of legions you lose by 1. And his special die action is remove 2 barbarians from your city, so he's all about offense. The Consul, as an action, add 1 legion to any city with a fort, or as an action, add 1 legion to your city. And his special die action is add 1 legion to your city, so he's about reinforcements. The Mercator, once during your turn as an action, give or take a card of a color matching your city to another player in your city.
You don't have to be in a city with a matching barbarian to do the Forge Alliance action. So they're very flexible with their card usage and exchanging. And their die action is remove 1 barbarian and 1 legion from your city. Praefectus Classis. As an action, you can move from a port to any other port. You may take up to 3 legions with you. So they don't need to discard cards to do that. If you are in a port, as an action, discard a city card matching the color of your city to add up to 2 legions to your city. And if his die action is if he's in a port, you can remove 1 barbarian from your city. Vestalis changes the setup of the game. You actually take all the unused event cards, because you don't use all of them, to form an event deck. At any time, discard a city card matching the color of your city you're in to draw one of those cards. So you can have extra sort of powers. During the draw 2-player card step, you may draw 3-player cards and put one of them back on top of the deck to mitigate scary cards, or cards you don't need. And the die action for them is just remove 1 legion from your city, so they're not great for battle. Regina Foderata, when you do the march or sail action, you may take up to 3 barbarians and or legions with you, so they can move barbarians around. And once per turn, you may do the Enlist Barbarians action without spending a card. And for their die result after the battle, remove 1 barbarian from your city. If you do, add up to 1 legion to your city. And finally, we have Praefectus Fabrum. As an action, remove 2 legions from your city to add a fort to it. And as an action, discard a city card to either move from a city with a fort to any city, or move from any city to a city with a fort. So they're all about those forts. You may take up to 3 legions with you. If in a city with a fort for their special die action, remove 2 barbarians from your city. This guy's a big fort head. And that's it. You just move around trying to fight off those cubes and prevent them from invading, and make those alliances and or kill those barbarians. And that's the game.
So I've played a lot of versions of Pandemic, and this one has its own distinct flavor that I really enjoy. Like, I love that it has what I love about Pandemic, which is like, oh, hey, oh, no, there's a Revolt card. Oh, we gotta put those cards on top of the deck. And oh, no, now they're more likely to be drawn and get infected or invaded in this game. And, you know, there's all that tension with the decks of cards and, you know, trying to optimize your moves and actions. But this one is the first one I've played where I feel like, oh, this is its own, like, unique sort of game and not just, like, Pandemic but with a different map, or Pandemic but with a slightly different, like, coat of paint. The additions of the legions that you can recruit and move around the board make it feel almost like a fun little war game. Even though at its core, it's still very Pandemic. It's still very familiar, but I actually don't mind the rolling dice in this. Usually that thing would kind of bother me, but in this, it's actually thematic and exciting. It makes the battles feel more dynamic. I really like that the barbarians invade in paths. Like in regular Pandemic, they can spawn anywhere pretty much. But in this, there is a logic to it. Like if they spawn, if they don't spawn here, they'll spawn in the next city. And it makes it feel like armies are actually marching towards Roma, which is very thematic, as opposed to the random spawning of previous Pandemic games. The event cards in this feel very powerful, and I like that you have the option for that corruption mechanic of, okay, let's take a risk. Like, this is such a good card. If we use this, it's worth it if we move the decline marker down. I also find it really cool that in this game, you don't have to necessarily get all 5 alliances to win. In the original Pandemic, you have to cure all 4 diseases. In this, you can get 3 of them and go, okay, we've got 3 alliances, just kill the other 2 off the board. It can make it so that you can change your plans and tactics as you run closer to the end of the game, and it really makes it feel like a strategic war map. This has essentially replaced original Pandemic for me because I get most of my Pandemic kicks out of Pandemic Legacy, and this feels different enough with its combat and barbarian mechanics while still preserving what I love about classic Pandemic that I like this version and will keep this as opposed to original Pandemic, which I feel is kind of redundant for me now that I have Pandemic Legacy. It's got tension, it's got teamwork, it's got that thrill of pursuing victory. It doesn't just feel like a pasted on theme. I really enjoy it. And if you like Pandemic, I recommend playing it. And even if you haven't played Pandemic, I think you'll really enjoy this. It's a lot of fun.